I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS. Thank you all for listening, and apologies for the delay this week. It has been it's been an intense week or so. I'm in a real crunch getting this freelance project finished, and I'm about lost my mind, but I wanted to take a breather because I missed talking to y'all and had some things on my mind. I do have a really good episode that I still need to edit with Matt Wall. I know some of you hate him. I know some of you love him. This is a really good conversation about when and why and if it is worthwhile to publish poems. It is something. It is a case in which he really changed. I won't say he completely changed my mind, but he completely changed the way I think about or frame this question. So that will be coming up probably next week. In the meantime, I would love it if you gave some thought to, like, what are the circumstances under which you read new poems, come upon new poems? What are the circumstances under which you post new poems? By whom? And publish poems, because I think all of these are questions worth maybe spending more time with than I had previously given them. So that will be coming up, but today this is just going to be a short one because I had I got a really good email this afternoon, and it made me think about a question I didn't think I had any. So it's a question about translation, and I'm not a translator. I have imitated a number of poems in other languages, but I don't really translate. I'm extremely skeptical of poetry and translation, and yet this question provoked some really strong feelings in me that I then felt that then seemed maybe worth pulling apart a little bit. I want to start though by doing something Zara suggested I do in a recent email, and read this particular poem aloud. This is The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter by Ezra Pound. There's a note under the title that says, After Li Po. It's an ancient Chinese poet. One of the two poets that Stephen Marsh writes about, he writes about the relationship between Li Po and another ancient Chinese poet. I cannot remember his name, but this is The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter. There was a poem by Li Po that Ezra Pound supposedly came upon and was interested in. He did not speak Chinese, didn't read Chinese, any species of Chinese, Mandarin, whatever else, Cantonese, and yet he came upon some version of this poem and he wanted to give a rendering of it. So this is his. You can call it a translation, or you can call it whatever you like. But this is The River Merchant's Wife, a Letter by Ezra Pound, after Li Po. While my hair was still cut straight across my forehead, I played about the front gate, pulling flowers. You came by on bamboo stilts, playing horse. You walked about my seat, playing with blue plums. And we went on living in the village of Chokan. Two small people, without dislike or suspicion. At 14, I married my Lord Yu. I never laughed, being bashful. Lowering my head, I looked at the wall. Called to 1,000 times, I never looked back. At 15, I stopped scowling. I desired my dust to be mingled with yours, forever and forever and forever. Why should I climb the lookout? At 16, you departed. You went into far Ku To En, by the river of swirling eddies, and you have been gone 5 months. The monkeys make sorrowful noise overhead. You dragged your feet when you went out. By the gate now, the moss is grown, the different mosses, too deep to clear them away. The leaves fall early this autumn, in wind. The paired butterflies are already yellow with August. Over the grass in the west garden, They hurt me. I grow older. If you are coming down through the narrows of the river Kiang, please let me know beforehand, and I will come out to meet you as far as Cho Fu Sa. Oh, interesting. Okay, so the Poetry Foundation has a... Do they just have slightly different lineation? Yeah, I think it's pretty much the same. Maybe they just changed the lineation in one line. Yeah. All right, so this is a poem, as I said, by Ezra Pound, translated from or based on an ancient poem by Li Po. Some of the obvious problems with this poem that come to mind are, let's see, one, it is translated from Chinese by a white guy who does not speak the language. Two, it is written in the voice of a young Chinese girl from centuries ago, and it is translated or composed by a 20th century white fascist guy. Three, he was a fascist. He was literally a fascist. He was imprisoned for treason and only got out of execution by being declared insane. Four, it arguably uses elements of Chinese plants and animals and even proper nouns for in order to stir a feeling of a mystical, eerie otherworldliness in specifically Western minds. Five, it is a love letter celebrating an arranged marriage involving a young girl who is decidedly not into it. So all of these are big problems with this poem. On the plus side, on the other hand, it's really beautiful. And by my lights, it rings pretty true in its way. It's a story of a girl who meets a boy in her village and plays with him and is put off by him and finds him, sort of has kind of neutral feelings toward him, but knows him. They come from the same place. They're pushed into this situation together, and she's resentful. She's also sulky the way, many 14-year-olds are sulky in any circumstances. And then she, like a lot of 15-year-olds, spins around and decides not only to be happily married to him, but to cast herself into a deep and epic romance. And then there's a very simple and very, in some ways, quotidian conflict. He has to travel for work. And he's gone a long time. And she misses him. There's a lot of pathetic fallacy, or at least some distinctive pathetic fallacy. The monkeys make sorrowful noise overhead. She looks around their property, their house, and their yard, and she sees signs of time passing, and she also sees reflections of her own sorrow, missing her husband, whom she does love, even if she loves him the way, maybe a 16-year-old loves someone. And then there's a specific request. This is not just a soliloquy. This is not just an expression of her feelings. It is an imperative. She ends by saying, if you are going to travel within any kind of range of here, please write me and let me know. And I will come meet you, even if it's just to say hello in passing, because I miss you that much. And in a curious way, citing this proper noun at the end, chofu sa, as the limit. That's as far as she'll go in order to go meet. We don't know how far that is, but we almost don't need to know. All we know is that it is saying something for her to make that commitment, that's how much she misses him. So it is childish, it is ambivalent, it is tender, it's funny. It feels to me like a very realistic adolescent love poem. And it's one that I find pretty moving as a middle-aged white man. Pound was probably younger than me when he wrote it, but I think reading it, I wonder if I remember liking it when I was this age, but I was still a guy at that age. I was the age of I think I first read it when I was 16, and I liked it then. I don't know. I don't know how true it rings to. I don't know how true it would ring to a Chinese girl of this class and in this region of China at this period historically, which I guess she's the one authority on the matter. But I do know that it feels very human. It feels very much the way love can feel, particularly at that age. So I like this poem. I'm reading it because I like it. I think it's quite beautiful. I'm going to quickly read it one more time through, just so you have it in your ears, because we will return to it in a different way a little later on. This is The River Merchant's Wife, a letter by Ezra Pound after Li Po. While my hair was still cut straight across my forehead. She says 15, 16, but she cites some of these specific cues that are not merely chronological or horological. She relates her age at the beginning by referring to her haircut. She tells you time is passing by showing you that the mosses have grown. So there's some nice sort of anchoring of time in the physical world. All right, I'll start over. I won't interrupt this time. While my hair was still cut straight across my forehead, I played about the front gate, pulling flowers. You came by on bamboo stilts, playing horse. You walked about my seat, playing with blue plums. And we went on living in the village of Chokan. Two small people, without dislike or suspicion. At 14, I married my Lord Yu. I never laughed, being bashful. Lowering my head, I looked at the wall. Called to, 1,000 times, I never looked back. At 15, I stopped scowling. I desired my dust to be mingled with yours, forever and forever and forever. Why should I climb the lookout? At 16, you departed. You went into far Kuto Yen by the river of swirling eddies, and you have been gone 5 months. The monkeys make sorrowful noise overhead. You dragged your feet when you went out. By the gate now, the moss is grown. The different mosses, too deep to clear them away. The leaves fall early this autumn, in wind. The paired butterflies are already yellow with August over the grass in the west garden. They hurt me. I grow older. If you are coming down through the narrows of the river Kiang, please let me know beforehand, and I will come out to meet you as far as Cho Fu Sa. Oh, and then in this edition, I'm reading from my paperback copy, it says by Rihaku. Well, fuck, Rihaku. Oh, okay, this is another name for Li Po, who's also called Li Bai and Li Bo. So, one poet, lots of names. At any rate, that's The River Merchant's Wife, a letter. And here now is the email I got this afternoon. I talked to the person who wrote it, and I will, at his request, leave out his name, but he did say it was all right to use the email itself, the details of the story. I know I've severely narrowed down the possibilities for who it would be by eliminating all of my legion of female admirers. But yeah, it was a guy who wrote this. He says I'm blah 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 blah. Hello, I'm turning to you because I respect you. Blah 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 blah. My question concerns the ethics, rules, manners of translation in a particular instance. This is a little bit of a long email, but I think it gets at a number of different angles to this question. So I think it's worth following. All right, he says, my favorite Chinese director, the great Zhang Yimou, who did Raise the Red Lantern, Hero, etc., blah 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 blah, has come out with a new movie this year called Full River Red, centered around the short Chinese lyrical poem Man Jiang Hong, ascribed to the medieval Chinese general and warrior poet Yue Fei. This is a poem I like a lot, and one that is famous in China, but not in the West. There is not a good English translation that I can find. The ones I have found are either in textbooks and written by non-literary translators, or are translated by people who do not seem to have a good command of English. So I decided that I would like to try to produce a good translation of this poem myself. I do not speak or read any Chinese languages, however, so I am having to use dictionaries to translate the traditional Chinese characters into English and compare those to the poor translations already available, as well as use the historical context for facts. I want to produce two versions. The first, a very straightforward, literal translation to use in a review of the film that I will write when Full River Red gets regular American distribution. The second, a loose translation in blank verse with more liberties taken with the language and a form reflecting the Chinese original. My question is, what do you think the ethics around this are? I do not speak or write the language and am not Chinese. Of course, I know Robert Hass did not know I've heard Hass and Haas. I don't know. Of course, I know Robert Hass did not know Japanese well when he translated the poetry of Basho, Buson, and Issa for his The Essential Haiku collection. And Hass was also the chosen English translator of Czesław Miłosz's Polish poetry, although Hass didn't speak Polish. However, these things are viewed differently today. What do you think about this? Also, how would I best go about writing a looser translation that would in many ways be my own poem? Could this be considered acceptable? Of course, I can do both translated versions for my own personal use, but I ask you because I would like to use one in a written review, and the other, if I think it's good enough, I might submit to publications. But I don't want to get canceled over it. LOL. It's a great question. My immediate instinctive answer was, fuck that, translate the poem if you want to translate it. Like, if you read a poem and you want to translate it, particularly if there aren't a lot of available translations in the language you know fluently, translate it. That's my immediate reflexive response. And then I thought, all right, let me give some thought to why one might answer that question differently. And I can think of a few different ways to slice it. So there was a controversy, was it like a year or so ago, that involved translations of Amanda Gorman's inaugural poem, The Hill We Climb. I think it's called The Hill We Climb, something like that. There were translations of it into umpteen different languages. It was very popular in English and celebrated around the world. So there was a controversy, though, because some of the publishers in non-English languages. So the controversy emerged from this wrinkle. Some of the translators hired to translate the poem into other languages. That is, some significant publisher in another language got the rights to publish a translation of Gorman's poem, and this is a pretty good bet to sell a few copies, at least as poems go. So this publisher hired a translator to translate it, so they could then put it out. And some of the translators hired to translate the poem into various other languages were white, and this caused stink. This caused some fuss, and people said, these white translators shouldn't be hired to translate this poem when black translators could be hired instead. It's not incidental to Gorman's poem that she's black. This is significant. She's a significant black literary figure today. We have to take this seriously and give, in addition to reflecting her identity in the new renderings of the poem, we also have to we can't use her poem as an opportunity to give white writers a leg up once again over black writers. So I think that these are some of the arguments about it. I didn't follow this controversy really at all. It didn't seem to me to be an especially interesting question, but I do think that it that it highlights maybe a distinction worth making here, which is that part of the controversy there was not just that these non-English white translators were going to translate Gorman's poem, but that they were being given a job. That is, like, there was a job to be given out, or a number of jobs in different countries, different contexts to be given out, and it was going to go to somebody. And so then there was a question of whether that somebody that the one job would go to should be a white translator or a black translator, or someone who is neither. So that is a question about which you could say a lot. I'm not going to here. I'm just going to identify it because that's not the question at stake here. That's not the question the listener is asking. There is not an existing job ready to be handed out to somebody, and he's not asking, like, oh, should I be the one to get that job? No, there is no job. There is no post. There is no brass ring. This is just something he is asking about doing on his own. So with that in mind, I'm very strongly inclined still to say, yeah, of course, if you want to translate this poem. But then I thought, like, all right, okay. Like, what would be the really, I don't want to represent arguments nobody makes, or, you know, I don't want to represent, like, silly arguments other people make and then dismiss them. I want to identify, like, what is the potentially strongest argument you could make against some white guy translating an ancient Chinese poem. And I think it's an argument that might come up even more. I think it might be even more applicable in the case of Ezra Pound's translation, which is, there is something that is lost when the only available renderings of a culture, or comments on a culture, or representations of a culture or a people are delivered by writers who don't belong to that group, right? If all of the representations of Chinese people, medieval Chinese people, whatever, if all of those representations are being set down by white guys, then there is a consistent, it's not, you know, even if all of those white guys have the best intentions, even if all of them have a great, you know, deal of respect and affection for the poet or the culture that they're representing, even so, there is clearly something missing in not getting any, you know, representation from people who maybe have a closer relationship to that culture. Yeah. If there were, and, you know, and arguably you could say, you know, the listener is proposing translating a poem that is not really well known in English. So he might well be his might well be the only version of this poem that a lot of us might encounter. And this is where I think two other questions really, really arise for me. One of which is simply, like, are there other perspectives available? Like, are there Chinese perspectives available on medieval Chinese literature? Even if there aren't translations of this particular poem in English that are satisfactory in English today, like, is it possible to get a non-white view, say, of ancient Chinese culture today, if you are interested in doing so? And I think the answer to that is yes. The question might have landed a little differently in Ezra Pound's time, but I think that even if this particular poem is not well known in English and is not much translated in English, I don't think that my listener is at risk of contributing to a white monopoly on the representation of Chinese culture. You might still say there's too much, you know, white guy representation of Chinese culture in America or in the English-speaking world. There's also, like, a pretty big skew racially there. just in terms of like what the population is made up of. But I don't think it's really fair to say like there's a lack of Chinese perspective available for those who might seek it out. Also, and I think this does really matter, like this is where I think I do butt heads with some listeners and some other people on questions of punching up and punching down. Not that anybody's punching anybody in this particular case, but I think aside from identity in a demographic sense or an ethnic sense or cultural sense, I think the prominence of your voice matters a lot. So if this listener were Robert Hass today, then it would be a slightly different question, right? Because he is, if he writes something, it's going to get read, it's going to get heard, it's going to take up a certain, it's going to eat up a certain amount of oxygen in the culture, right? At least as far as poetry ever does that, right? If you have a prominent voice, I mean, this is why, like, again, I think Shane, like, rightly criticized some of my language in knocking Lynn Heginian, but I think apart from the infelicities of my diction, I think it's like fair for me to knock her for a variety of reasons, but like among which, like not a small reason is that she's really famous and I'm not. So I think like my listener, who is a very thoughtful and good writer, but is not at all famous, like he's not going to drown out voices by writing a translation of a poem he loves. Now, getting to the second question, like, is translation possible? I don't know if I actually mentioned that, but that was the second question I had in mind. Like, is translation actually possible? I think he talks about these two different versions of the poem he wants to do. Here he says, I'll read it again. He says, I want to produce two versions. The first, a very straightforward literal translation to use in a review of the film that I will write when Full River Red gets regular American distribution. The second, a loose translation in blank verse with more liberties taken with the language and a form reflecting the Chinese original. So he refers to the first as straightforward and literal, and the second as loose, but he also says in the second that he wants the form to reflect the Chinese original, meaning that it may be looser in denotation. I'm assuming that's what he means by literal and straightforward. He means preserving the denotation of the language. But in doing so, he's going to be sacrificing the form. Whereas in the second version, I would say it's not necessarily a looser version. The denotative rendering may be looser, but the formal rendering is going to be a lot tighter if you don't preserve that in the first version and you do preserve it in the second. I think, when I read this, I see like the whole problem of translation, which is that there are so many different facets of poetry that are worth preserving, and it tends to be very difficult to preserve more than one or two of them well in a given translation. I mean, this is the feeling I always have about classical poetry, that with the exception of like Chris Childers, A. Stallings, Aaron Pachikian, Ryan Wilson, a number of other people, I think like a lot of classical poetry gets translated, especially classical lyric poetry in particular, with narratives and dramas. It's a little bit, but with lyric poetry, the denotation will get preserved, and sometimes even the form will get preserved, right? Because you have a really skillful English translator who can preserve the sapphic stanzas or whatever, the hendecasyllabic lines. Those things will get preserved, the denotation of the form, but the lyric effect is almost always lost. They don't snap, they don't bite, they don't draw blood. And if they don't do that, then I would say those are not actually very accurate translations, because they don't convey the effect of the original. In the same way that, like, you might translate a joke, but if it's not funny, well, you're not really conveying what it is. You're just conveying information. And this is where I really tend to think, like, you know, the smaller the poem, the less it is translatable. There are poems that, you know, much of which can be translated, and I cherish a lot of those. I mean, Horace is one of my big guys, and I don't really speak Latin. I mean, I don't speak Latin at all. I can stumble through some of the words, and I can recognize some things, but I'm always reading him in translation, even if I'm reading him in multiple translations, and in some trots and, you know, kind of word by word breakdowns. But there's a lot there that's lost, and the shorter and tighter the poem, the less it's going to be translatable. The example that comes immediately to mind is Ogden Nash's poem Fleas, which reads in its entirety, Adam had 'em. That's it. Fleas. Adam had 'em. It's not bad. I mean, it's hokey, but it's like that's not bad. And I believe if my memory serves, the actual rendering on the page, he replaces the H in had with an apostrophe, so it's like the poem's being pronounced in a Cockney accent. Adam. So that is untranslatable. There's no way to render that into another language in any meaningful sense. You could explain what he's doing. You could write down the denotation of it. But like, imagine how disappointed you would be if you read if you heard Ogden Nash was this great wit, this great American wit, and then you read a version of that poem in French, and it just like it would just be like this sort of weird, bland statement that wouldn't have any of the delight of the silly compression and, ridiculous rhyme of the original. I'm always ambivalent about translation. When I really mean, translation of lyric poems, translations of short poems. I'm really ambivalent about that. To the point where, to fantasize about a problem I'm not lucky enough to confront. I ask myself, like, I wonder what I would say if someone wanted to translate my poems. And I think, like, on the one hand, like, I'm not saying no to a lot of opportunities like that these days. So, like, yeah, if somebody wanted to translate my poems, I would say sure. But I don't really think it would be good. Like, I don't really think it would work very well. Maybe with some of the narrative stuff, there would be something there. But for the most part, I write little lyric mousetraps. And I think, I don't know, like, to the extent to which they're successful in English, they're basically not going to translate. Now, there is a thing that one can do with translation, which is, I think, probably what Pound is doing. Anthony Hecht has a rendering of Horace sonnet that's like this. There are, Ben Jonson does this with Catullus. There are innumerable examples of people taking poems from other languages. Oh, Thomas Wyatt's, one of my very favorite poems in English, Whoso List to Hunt, I Know Where Is an Hind, is a sort of translation of Petrarch. But of course, it is rendered in just sparkling, gorgeous English lines that, like, clearly can't be one-to-one translations from the Italian. He's having to basically, like, the thing you can do with a poem is you can render it. The thing you can do with a poem that you love in another language is you can imitate it. You can say there's a thing that he does with this poem that it has some of these elements that I really like, and he achieves this effect that I really admire, and it has a whole mood or a whole atmosphere or a whole feel that I love, or maybe even a sound. And I want to take inspiration from those elements and try to make something cool with them. This is something I do a lot. Like, there are a lot of poems that I read. I've never really written a proper translation, or I've never written a publishable translation, but I have read a lot of poems in other languages and thought, like, this is really cool. I want to do something based on this, after this, which is, I think, not a bad way to use that after. Sometimes people use after just to mean, like, hey, I like Terrence Hayes or Ocean Vuong or whoever I'm saying after. But, I think like after is not a bad way to mark an imitation of a poem in another language, but while acknowledging that like, you're not really translating it. So, I think like there is again here maybe like another slightly, like a little bit of a hair to split when it comes to my listener's question, which is like, if you are simply translating for the sake of scholarship or for the sake of education, if you're translating a poem from another language into English, that is really an act of service. Now, which is not to say these poems, it's not to say that kind of translation can't also be beautiful, can't also be accomplished, or scholastically significant. But if your primary purpose is education, is to give a representation of the original, then that is really an act of service. And I think I find myself pretty impatient with anyone who would say, you should not try to do that because you are the wrong race. I think that's a really pinched and impoverished view of literature. Now, the other thing, right, the imitation, the after, right, the inspired by version, that is a little bit closer to that. Like that gets us closer to the territory of cultural appropriation, which people have had lots to say about. My impulse when it comes to that question as well is, if you want to write a good poem, write a good poem. I think that like there have certainly been cases of white people really taking advantage of non-white artists or non-white source material and kind of using it in a parasitic way or an exploitative way. But for the most part, I think if you want to write a good poem and you like another poem and it inspires you, then just fucking write it. Again, as with the Peter Orner thing, like it's not that nobody can yell at you about it. It's just that like it's worth making. Like this is, I can't imagine that. I mean, who knows what the Chinese medieval general might think, warrior poet. I mean, he might say, off with the white devil's head. Who knows? But I can't imagine that to the extent to which Yue Fei was a poet, I can't imagine that the poet in him would not find it touching that this white guy centuries and centuries later on the other side of the world loves his poem, and despite not knowing the original language and having to cobble it together from various partial renderings, wants to produce a version of it for people in his language to admire. I can't imagine that Yue Fei wouldn't find that touching. Isn't that what we're after here? This sort of connection across time and space? So yeah, I think my long answer is the same as my short answer, which is go ahead and fucking write it. Like write it and do your review and provide it as a service, and then also do the, if you want to write a poem based on it, if you want to write, a closer translation, whatever you want to do with it, if that poem makes you want to write a poem, then go for it. And if it's good, or if somebody wants to publish it, great. I really don't think in this case, as a not famous white guy poet in America, I don't think you're drowning out anybody's voice. I may be wrong. I mean, if you're listening and you think I've really missed something here, or I'm not accounting for some big part of the question, please write, let me know. Write in, tell me. But for my money, I think it would be a pretty flinty, uncharitable view of art that would say the better thing for you to do when you love this poem is to shut up. Like, I can't, it's hard for me to get the math to work there. I just think that if that's the conclusion you come to, then something is wrong with your priorities. To use an oxymoron that my former teacher Greg Williamson has pointed out before. There's no such thing as multiple priorities. There is one priority at a time. I mentioned Greg also because I'm going to close today by reading a poem of his. This poem has a familiar title. It is from his 1995 collection, The Silent Partner, and it is called The River Merchant's Wife, A Letter. It's exactly the same title as Ezra Pound's poem, based on the Li Po or Rihaku. And what Greg did is he wrote a version of the same poem. The adolescent girl meets the young guy, has ambivalence about him. They end up getting together pretty young. She comes to feel, deep fondness and devotion, and she misses him when he's gone. He takes a cue from Pound and uses hairstyle and yard trimmings and various other domestic knickknacks to represent the passage of time. And he grounds the speaker's feelings in a very quotidian, familiar physical reality, and expresses this sense of longing. That's, again, it is... you could argue that Pound is performing Orientalism or exoticizing, but I would say what he's really doing is he's making this adolescent Chinese girl story really familiar, really close to home. It really sounds like something that somebody might say in our part of the world today. And Greg, I think, came to the same conclusion. So he did another version of it that is also, I think, rendering the potentially exotic actually very close and familiar. And I think quite touching in its humility. All right, so this is The River Merchant's Wife, A Letter by Greg Williamson. Before I grew my bangs, Lisa and me were smoking in the Crystal parking lot. I'm going to start that again just so you can get your bearings. This is The River Merchant's Wife, A Letter by Greg Williamson. Before I grew my bangs, Lisa and me were smoking in the Crystal parking lot. And you and Mike drove by in the Gray Ghost. You had just got your earring then, remember? How about a ride, you said. And I said, if you're driving. I barely had my boobs. But we ran all the stop signs to the park. God, I was so wet, but I wouldn't. Every time we moved, you knocked the horn. I think about that now. How long? In Cleveland, is it cold? I keep the floodlights on all night. When I pull in the driveway from the shop, Charlie sits at the fence. He looks so sad. I've mowed 4 times since you've been gone. And now the yard's knee-deep in maple leaves. They seem more red this year. Mike called. He had some tickets for the game. Everybody misses you, you know. Already, the air smells cold. It smells like football. And the school bus comes by every morning. That was so long ago. Please call me soon. Please tell me when you're coming home. I bought some lingerie. So that's The River Merchant's Wife by Greg Williamson. Wonderful poet, of course. So I think I offered my best answer to the listener. If you have more questions, listener, or if any of you have questions or objections or comments, as always, I welcome them. Oh, also quickly, just because I mentioned the Pound poem, and because in my soon-to-be-released conversation with Matt Wall, he kind of gave me a little bit of I think, deserved grief about the question is not promoting, but about not letting people know when they might read something of mine. So I did publish a poem. Joshua Meakin actually took a poem for the magazine. He's the poetry editor of it. The magazine's called Root Quarterly, and he publishes, I believe it's 2 poems per issue. One is an older poem and one's a newer poem, and he writes a little thing about the 2 of them. I wrote a poem responding to the River Merchant's Wife, actually, a different, very different than either than the original or than Greg's, but I did. It was something I felt moved to write. Also being an unqualified white guy, monoglot, but that came out. I think I'm pretty happy with it, and I recommend you to it. I commend you to it. I wish you would go find it. I have to say, I don't think I have a copy. I don't know. Root Quarterly is very dogmatic about not doing online stuff. They're big print only people. So there is a print copy of it somewhere in the world. Maybe I'll see one at some point, and and maybe you will too. So I'll put a link to their website, and maybe go take a look at that. You can reach me, as always, at sleerickets@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.